Aegon's prophecy, the Song of Ice and Fire, is a central part of House of the Dragon and seems very important to the Targaryens, but by the time we get to Daenerys and the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire, she doesn't seem to know it. So when was it lost and how? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we cover George R. R. Martin's world of Ice and Fire in depth, as well as The Lord of the Rings and The Witcher. Welcome. We are introduced to Aegon the Conqueror's prophecy or dream that he called the Song of Ice and Fire in House of the Dragon Season 1, Episode 1. When Viserys makes Rhaenyra his heir, he tells her, explaining that it was a secret passed from Targaryen ruler to Targaryen heir. 'Tis to begin with a terrible winter, gusting out of the distant north. Aegon saw absolute darkness riding on those winds, and whatever dwells within will destroy the world of the living. When this great winter comes, Rhaenyra, all of Westeros must stand against it, and if the world of men is to survive, a Targaryen must be seated on the Iron Throne, a king or queen strong enough to unite the realm against the cold and the dark. Associated with that is also the prophecy engraved on the Valyrian steel dagger. From my blood come the prince that was promised, and his will be the Song of Ice and Fire. So there will be a promised prince, or princess presumably, High Valyrian as a language is quite flexible when it comes to gender, to whom this prophecy will particularly apply. And we have confirmation from Ryan Condal, the showrunner, that this idea originally came from George R. R. Martin himself, so we can expect to see it appear in some form in the books too. Viserys is clear that this prophecy is only passed from ruler to heir. I doubt that a bit, but I did a whole other video on that if you're interested. And at the start of House of the Dragon, he seems to be the only person who knows it. We see him pass it on to his heir Rhaenyra, and then in Season 2, her pass it on to her heir Jacaerys. But by the time we get to the main story of A Song of Ice and Fire and Daenerys, it's very apparent that Dany doesn't know the prophecy. We get over 30 chapters from her POV and absolutely no indication that she knew about it, even when she's confronted with a vision of someone talking about the Song of Ice and Fire. So when and how did the prophecy get lost? Because this is actually quite important. The thread that runs through Targaryen history and the name of the entire book series. I suppose the first place to look is the Dance of the Dragons itself. At the time of writing this video, on the show, two people know of the prophecy, Rhaenyra and Jace. Rhaenyra assumed that Daemon knew, but he didn't. Maybe she told him off camera, but we don't have any evidence of that. And other than the inscription on the Valyrian steel dagger, it doesn't seem to be written down anywhere. So we'll proceed on the basis that two people knew the prophecy at that point. Two people that... Spoilers here, by the way, for House of the Dragon. We assume they'll stick reasonably closely to the books, and if so, well, spoilers are coming in my very next sentence. Rhaenyra and Jace both die during the dance. Jace died first, and I think it's fair to assume that after he did, Rhaenyra then told her next in line Joffrey, young as he was, but Joffrey himself died just a few months later, so what then? Well, her next in line after that was her son Aegon, who was perhaps 10 years old. After she was killed horrifically and unexpectedly, would young Aegon have remembered and held the prophecy for future generations? Given how he then understandably grew up to hate dragons, it seems unlikely, but not impossible. Anyway, that's the first point at which some theorise that the prophecy may have been lost. The second is with King Baelor the Blessed, Aegon III's second son. He was a pious man, zealously so. Indeed, we're told that he basically starved himself to death while fasting, or perhaps he was poisoned because he was about to start a holy war. Either way, quite keen on the faith of the Seven. And he definitely burned a lot of books that he considered heretical. It's hard to imagine him passing on a prophecy that wasn't from the faith onto his heir. So it seems entirely reasonable to think that at one of those 2 points the prophecies stopped being passed down from ruler to heir, and it's certainly fair to say that the next longish ruling king, Aegon IV, showed no real signs that he was trying to rule by that prophecy. So for the prophecy to have survived past that rocky patch of Targaryen rule, we would have to assume that it was either passed on via some route we don't know about. I don't know, maybe Rhaenyra did eventually tell her husband Daemon, who told his 2 sons with her, and Viserys II told his grandson, who would become Daeron II. That might be a bit convoluted, but it's definitely possible. Or maybe it was just recorded in a scroll for later generations to discover. Added to which, it becomes apparent in the main book series that the prophecy of the prince that was promised is very, very similar to the prophecy of Azor Ahai Reborn, which was seemingly known in Asozi or Red God circles for a long time. When Maester Aemon and Melisandre interact, they seem to use the terms interchangeably. What I'm trying to say is that although there probably were times where Aegon's prophecy was not passed down from ruler to heir as we're told it should, that doesn't mean that the prophecy was lost, per se. Perhaps it was recorded on a scroll, or a different version was preserved overseas. In fact, we know that that must have happened, because although Daenerys didn't know about the prophecy, her brother Rhaegar definitely did. More on that in just a moment. So, actually trying to identify the moment the prophecy was lost in the dance or later, assuming it was, is kind of missing the point, because it was clearly rediscovered. George R. R. Martin hasn't told us yet. Perhaps if we ever get Fire and Blood Part 2, that will be when, but my best guess is with a king that often goes under the radar, Aerys I. We're told that his interests were largely to do with dusty tomes concerned with ancient prophecy and the higher mysteries, arcane lore, and ancient history. He sounds like the perfect person to rediscover an ancient prophecy, added to which he was seemingly close to Bloodraven, and, well, if you're a regular on this channel, you'll know that when in doubt we should always blame Bloodraven. That era of Targaryens around Aerys I is also very clearly the most magical of Targaryen eras. As well as a king obsessed with arcana and prophecy, we have Bloodraven and Shira Seastar, and multiple dragon dreamers like Daeron, Aemon, Aerion, Aegon, Daemon II Blackfire, and so on. Noticeably, during Aegon V's reign, we get the Woods Witch delivering the prophecy that the prince that was promised would be born from the line of his grandchildren Aerys and Rhaella. Jaehaerys, their father, clearly believed it, and seems to have named his firstborn son after the king who was obsessed with prophecy, Aerys. And perhaps most notably, the prince that was promised prophecy seems to have just been understood by people. The Woods Witch didn't prophesy that there would be a prince that was promised, but that the prince that was promised would be born from a certain line. People clearly already knew what the prince that was promised was. So by the time we get to Rhaegar, at least the prince that was promised prophecy seems to have been very much well known. And to be clear, it seems that the prince that was promised is simply about who will be the Targaryen that the bigger prophecy is most applicable to, who will be the one who has to defend humanity against the others. Rhaegar seems to have initially concluded that it was him, then that it was his son Aegon. If we need further proof that he knew about both parts of the prophecy, we get it in a vision in the House of the Undying. Dany sees a whole series of visions, but one of them is of Rhaegar and his wife Elia after the birth of his son Aegon. They are discussing what to name their newborn. "Aegon," he said to a woman nursing a newborn babe in a great wooden bed, "what better name for a king?" "Will you make a song for him?" the woman asked. "He has a song," the man replied. "He is the prince that was promised, and his is the Song of Ice and Fire." He goes on to say that there should be one more child, because the dragon must have 3 heads. But, of course, Elia can't have another child, so that will have to come from elsewhere, so to speak. Rhaegar already seems to think that there's a bit of a rush here, however. He thinks his son will need to face the nameless horrors in the terrible winter gusting from the far north. But then something happens, and a hat tip here to the Red Mice at Play blog for first pointing this out to me. Winter comes then, unexpectedly. There was the full spring, remember, when the tourney at Harrenhal happened. At the time, people will have just thought that that was spring, normal. Then, out of nowhere, winter came back. We read this in the world of Ice and Fire. As the year drew to a close, winter returned to Westeros with a vengeance. On the last day of the year, snow began to fall on King's Landing, and a crust of ice formed atop the Blackwater Rush. The snowfall continued off and on for the best part of a fortnight, by which time the black water was hard frozen, and icicles draped the roofs and gutters of every tower in the city. As cold winds hammered the city, King Aerys II turned to his pyromancers, charging them to drive the winter off with their magics. Huge green fires burned along the walls of the Red Keep for a moon's turn. An unexpected winter so cold that King's Landing, normally quite a warm place, had icicles hanging from every tower, and King Aerys tried to fight it off with magic. How might Rhaegar, obsessed with prophecy, interpret this? Well, he will have been looking out for a terrible winter gusting out of the distant north. Surely this was it. He rushes to complete his part of the prophetic imperative. The dragon must have 3 heads, he must have another child, and his wife cannot have another child. He sets off to find Lyanna. But soon he and his father are both dead. Robert's rebellion sweeps the Targaryens from power. We're left to assume that Aerys didn't have time or inclination to pass on the prophecy to Viserys, and so he never knew it to pass it on to Daenerys. So when was it lost? Well, perhaps during the Dance of the Dragons, perhaps with Baelor. Either way leaves just a short period of time, perhaps 2 or 3 generations where the Targaryens didn't have it. But then later they did again, and then they didn't. And the funny thing is, whereas I'm sure the prophecy did prompt Aegon's invasion in the first place, and may well have influenced several individual Targaryens' actions, for the most part, the way it was interpreted and applied on the show, an exhortation for the Targaryens to rule the whole 7 kingdoms and to stay united, is probably what they would have done anyway. Good rulers would try to strengthen the kingdom, deliver peace and prevent divisions in the ruling family, even without the prophecy to tell them to do so. And in the book, Dany seems set on a path to reconquer the 7 kingdoms without knowing about the prophecy at all. And we also haven't seen anything yet from the prophecy about exactly what this prince that was promised must do when that terrible winter comes, other than to sit on the Iron Throne and unite and lead the people against the others. Aegon's prophecy was known by at least some Targaryens all the way down to Daenerys' own generation, with perhaps a few breaks. And now it's probably preserved somewhere in some dusty old tomes, and by Bloodraven and Quaithe, perhaps. It actually doesn't matter that the leading candidates to be the prince that was promised don't know about it. There are plenty of people around them who do, and will try their best to make sure they fulfill it. If you'd like more videos like this, breaking down the deeper lore of George R.R. Martin's world of Ice and Fire, there's a playlist appearing now on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.